Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force, and I'm very proud today, 16th of December 2021, to be presenting the first draft of TTF's plans and priorities for 2022. The overall idea of this particular session is basically just to share what we're planning to do with friends and members and acquaintances with the view to getting your feedback. So the session's got two parts. Part one is essentially about sharing what we're planning to do, and part two is essentially about getting your thoughts and feedback and questions and comments and suggestions. I'm very, very open to suggestions. The TTF is very much a team game, and whilst of course I'm in a position to make decisions about stuff, I always go about my decision-making process in as inclusive a manner as I can. That I think has been a reason for the growth and expansion of TTF over the last 6 years or so, because we're getting so much brilliant input from so many great people. And if I was doing this all on my own, we would be just a teeny tiny fraction of what we are today. I'm going to share my screen to work through a bunch of slides. There are quite a few. I promise I will not be speaking to every bit of detail on the slides, because there's far too much content for that. I'll just give you the general flavour of what the slides actually. Okay, so Mark, can you just confirm that you're looking at a little picture of me and the slides themselves? Great. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much for your patience, folks. Okay, so we're talking about TTS plans and priorities for 2022. This event today is called part one. The reason it's called part one is because on the 4th of January, we're going to be running part two. Between now and the 4th of January, I will be absorbing all the feedback that I get from you, whether that's feedback I received today during the session or emails afterwards. So please do think of today's session as an opportunity to help TTF to refine its plans and priorities for next year. You're all very familiar with the TTF. This slide just basically says that we're all about trying to reform the financial services sector, and that we are very respectful of the 1914 comment by Justice Louis Brandeis, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant. That kind of begs the question, well, what is it that needs disinfecting? And there's a great deal of evidence from a multitude of sources suggesting that there is a great deal wrong with the financial services sector. One of the sources of information that supports the idea is Violation Tracker UK, which many of you will be very familiar with. The key point is that the data within Violation Tracker UK shows that the financial services industry has more fines against it than virtually all of the other industries added together. This really does speak to the idea that there is something profoundly unhealthy with the way that the financial services sector actually works. Here's the Edelman Trust Barometer. If you're not familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, it really is a hugely useful annual research exercise. I believe there are something like 30,000 research respondents a year. And what you can see is that it charts how trustworthy different industries are. And as you can see, financial services is just one step up from social media. And in fact, most years, financial services is actually the least trustworthy of all. So we would suggest this points to some kind of systemic problem with the nature of the financial industry that needs sorting out. I could go on for ages about this, but I'm not. I'm going to switch through very, very quickly. This slide simply speaks to the idea that all organizations, whether not-for-profits or commercial organizations, operate within an ecosystem, and that ecosystem applies constraints to it. The plans and priorities we have for 2022 are highly cognizant of the harsh reality that the Transparency Task Force operates within many, many constraints. And that's because perhaps we've tended to be too open to doing too much in the past. And I put that down to me, and that's very much my fault. But the attitude I've tended to have in the past has been, If I might be able to help to do it, I'll do it. If I might be able to help, I'll do it. And that, I suppose, is an extension of my attitude, wanting to try to help, but it has resulted in us ending up with an unbearably high workload. And as this slide shows, I'm simply now of the decision that I definitely do need to change my ways. If I don't, I'll burn myself out. Currently, and this is a bit personal, but I want you to really understand the drivers behind the decision making that I'm going to be articulating to you. I currently work 6 or 7 days a week. I very rarely have any time off. I more than I should wake up in the middle of the night and do work. Frankly, it's causing all kinds of problems in terms of health, in terms of work-life balance, in terms of family life. So I simply have to somehow get on top of that and manage it. I appreciate this is personal. It's about me, but I do need to change my ways. Frankly, this doesn't necessarily in any way mean TTF will do less. In fact, quite the opposite. Because of the diminishing returns you experience when you are working too much and too hard, it's quite possible that for most of 2021, I've been working in a very suboptimal way. I need to work smarter, not harder. I need to change the way that I work. I need to become more of the, if you like, the conductor in the orchestra and less of the person actually playing the instruments. So that's essentially what this slide is about. Thank you for allowing me to be that personal with you. I really do want you to understand why I am thinking the way that I am. I know myself well enough to know that the idea of not doing everything I possibly could do is going to be quite difficult for me. I find it very easy to feel awkward and to feel guilty about saying no. But I absolutely am convinced that if I don't change the way that I operate, then I'm going to burn myself out. If I burn myself out, that's going to be pretty detrimental to TTF and the overall bigger picture work that we're trying to do. So the way I'm rationalizing this in my own mind, ladies and gentlemen, is simply to believe that by taking better care of myself, I can survive for longer, overcome the issues that I've got, and as a consequence, TTF can actually be a more effective force for good in the financial services sector. Excuse me. The next slide simply confirms this idea that I have made the decision to change the way that I work. The point here is absolutely key. Excuse me. It's rather than working in terms of if I might be able to help, I'll do it. I have to start thinking in terms of if it makes sense for me to do it, I'll do it. There's a big transition between the two. And that leads to two key questions. One is, what determines if something makes sense for TTF to do? And if TTF should do it, who within TTF is best placed to do it? This gives us three questions. Two of them are shown on this slide. These three questions are what I call the test questions to determine whether to do or not to do. So I'm borrowing a bit of Shakespeare. Instead of to be or not to be, I'm asking to do or not to do. Test question number one is, what levels of harm are being caused by the problem? What levels of harm are being caused by the problem? So when considering whether to do something or not, I will be taking into account how much harm the problem is causing. Could it be high, could be moderate, could be low? Obviously, if it's high, then I'm much more likely to think that this is something that TTF ought to get involved with. And the second question, and this is a really important one, the second question is, what's the scarcity of organizations acting on the problem? What I mean by that is, how many organizations are there that are already trying to address this particular challenge? There may be hardly any at all. In other words, the scarcity is high, or it might be moderate, or it might be low. And remember, low in this context means there's low scarcity. In other words, there's loads of organizations already trying to do something about that. And if we take those two questions, we can create for ourselves a 3x3 matrix. Everybody loves a 3x3 matrix. Very simple, very straightforward. The horizontal axis is the levels of harm caused by the problem, and the vertical axis is the levels of harm caused by the problem, and the horizontal axis is how many organizations in terms of scarcity are already dealing with the issue. So as you can see, that gives us a box at the bottom left-hand corner of this 3x3 matrix, where the harm being caused is low and the scarcity of organization is also low. In other words, there's an abundance of organizations dealing with it. So the closer we are to the bottom left-hand corner, the less sense it makes for TTF to allocate its very limited and very constrained raw resources to issues that are in that bottom left-hand corner. Conversely, at the top right quadrant, the top right square represents where the levels of harm caused by the problem are high, and the scarcity is also high. In other words, there's hardly anybody else doing anything about it. So I hope that's clear enough. And if we go one step further, we see that we've got the no areas where it really does not make any sense at all for TTF to become involved. That's because there's an abundance of organizations already doing something about the problem. It doesn't really make sense for TTF to go and get involved in areas where lots of other organizations are already active, and we really have to realistically question what level of meaningful difference we can make. Similarly, where the levels of harm are low, and of course this is all relative, where the levels of harm are relatively low, we ought to also really question whether it makes sense for TTF to get involved. So of the 9 squares, a total of 5 of them are, for want of a better phrase, no-go zones for TTF, given that TTF has to allocate its resources in a very, very miserly way because we have such little resource. We've got 3 squares which represent the maybes. That's where there may be enough harm to warrant attention by TTF, and where the scarcity of the organizations is sufficiently high for TTF to get involved as well. And perhaps most importantly, and you know where we're going with this, folks, already, most importantly, we have the top right-hand corner. And the top right-hand corner represents those issues where a lot of harm is happening, and also where there's hardly any other organizations dealing with it. But you'll see, I haven't put an unqualified yes in there. What I've put is, yes, if we have the capability to make meaningful change. And that capability question is our third question of the 3 test questions. And that third question, as you can see, is what's the size of our capability to make a meaningful difference? The reason I've used the word size here, although it may not be grammatically correct, is because it means we can keep with the theme of small, moderate, or big. What's the size of our capability? So clearly, if we have big capability, in other words, if we could do quite a lot about this problem, then that's going to be a positive factor in determining whether TTF should or shouldn't get involved in a particular issue. And this gives us the obvious conclusion from this 3x3 matrix. The obvious conclusion is that we should focus on where the levels of harm are high, where the number of organizations dealing with the problem are low, and where we believe we are capable of making a meaningful difference. That's a pretty, I think, irrefutable bit of logic, but it's not kind of set in stone. There are no hard and fast rules here. And the reality is that we're transitioning from one way of thinking about things to a new way. So probably for the first 3 or maybe 4 months in next year, we'll still be doing some stuff that according to this criteria, we probably shouldn't do, but we'll do it because we've made some kind of commitment that we're going to be doing it. Therefore, I will, stay with the commitments that we've already made. Now, before we go much further, I want to pause in a short while with some questions and comments just on what we've covered so far. But what I will do before we get there is explain what we have in the top right-hand corner. I'll go into detail about this in a moment, but what you can see is that in the top right-hand corner, we have identified regulatory failure. Regulatory failure is causing high levels of harm, and there are very, very, very few organizations actually tackling this problem head on. Now, in a moment, I'm going to open it up to Q&A and get some initial comments and feedback on what I've covered so far. But before I do that, I just want to really stress, I'm about to, after the Q&A, explain the logic behind why we have positioned regulatory failure in the top right-hand corner of this chart. But let me stop sharing my screen now. And just in case anybody has any, I would be very, very pleased to respond to any comments or questions that anybody would like to make in light of what I've covered so far. If there aren't any, I will simply move swiftly on to the next bit. But if there are, I'll happily take them. Mr. Ian Davis, please, Ian, introduce yourself and share your thought. Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name's Ian Davis. I'm a victim of London Capital Finance, and I'd just actually like to comment on regulation. Companies House, especially, it's amazing how many directors commit to fraud. It's so visible. I've got lots and lots of instances of directors voluntarily striking off companies. This is actually relating to London Capital Finance mainly. And it just goes on and on. There's so much fraud, which is so obvious. There's money laundering going on. It's absolutely unbelievable. I've contacted Companies House numerous times with all the proof to back it up. Nothing happens whatsoever. I go over to the insolvency service. Nothing happens there. Also, the Institute of Chartered Accounting in the Wales. I've also reported various chartered accountants, all involved in fraud, connected to convicted criminals. It just goes on and on. Nothing seems to happen. It just seems like it's a massive cover-up. Yeah.
Ian, I understand, and what you've just commented on aligns so well with what I'm about to say. It's almost as if I'd set you up to say that, but I promise I haven't. I promise I haven't said that. But Ian, we absolutely get you. There is a cocktail of issues that we are becoming so concerned about, so really, really concerned about that. Absolutely, I think you're on the money there, Ian. Thank you. We'll go to Richard Emery, then we'll go to Mark Ormston. Mr. Richard Emery, please introduce yourself, because not everybody on the call will know you.
Okay, sorry, yes. Richard Emery, professionally, I investigate bank fraud. I serve on the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Personal Banking, and am campaigning for major reform and major changes in the way personal banking operates. Andy, at this stage, the only thing that I want to say is to applaud what you have just gone through by facing up to the situation that you've done, because I've been there, and to some extent at the moment, I am there at the moment.
Sure.
Of saying, I have got too much in my inbox, you've had too much in your inbox. And there's a point where you have to say, whoa, stop, review, make some really, really hard decisions. And what you are saying is absolutely, you have my absolute support, but you also have my absolute respect for the fact that you have said what you have said. I know what long hours and excessive hours means, and I absolutely applaud, absolutely support. There needs to be this reframing. We've grown and we've grown and we've grown, and there is a point where you have to just say what you have just said. So absolutely support what you're saying, go for it.
Richard, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That means a great deal to me. It really, really does. It really, really does. So finding yourself, forcing yourself to think differently, it's not easy. And there are people on this call, Sarah Hutchinson's here, for example, and many others, who have, for the last 2 years, been kind of coaching me to let go of stuff and to change the way that I'm thinking. So hearing somebody like you, Richard, kind of give me permission, so to speak, to think in this way is just it takes a massive weight off my shoulders. It really does, and it frees me up to think in a different way. Thank you, Richard. Brilliant. Absolutely delighted to hear that. Mr. Mark Ormston, to you, sir.
Thanks, Andy. It's, to be honest, Richard just covered exactly what I was going to say. I just wanted, before we moved on, just to quickly say, you know, congratulations for everything that you've done. Getting the TTF to this point, it's been phenomenal. And what you've just outlined is phenomenal. So you should be really, really proud, Andy. And you shouldn't see it as a step away. You should see it as a ongoing, continuous improvement of the group. So very well done.
Fantastic. I really wasn't expecting this kind of reaction, but I really wasn't. Thanks, Mark. Mr. Paul Smith. Thank you, Mark.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Andy. And I just want to sort of really echo the comments already made. You know, I'm working with a chap at the moment who's the CEO of a startup company, and you can see the signs. And, you know, we've tried to cajole him into taking his foot off the gas. But the type of character he is, he's just going head on, and I can see the signs. He's just going to crash and burn, and just fantastic. Glad that you've noticed it, and yeah, it's a step in the right direction. I just wanted to comment about Companies House and the Insolvency Service. Having spent 6 months this time last year working for BEIS, Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, I was part of a small team of investigators investigating fraud in relation to the bounce back loan.
Right.
And with that, of course, we worked alongside Companies House and the Insolvency Service. And I couldn't wait to get out of a very toxic environment, which was that that government sort of setup, which was doomed to fail from the start. But what I really identified is the lack of ability of Companies House to act, and they are hamstrung, and their only sort of investigative arm is the Insolvency Service, and they are totally swamped with investigations, and some of the stuff that was pretty obvious that I thought they should have taken on, they didn't, and
right.
It's got to change.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thanks for your very helpful and supportive comments, and also stressing what has been mentioned earlier by others. So the Companies House is so important, because if we don't have Companies House right, we've effectively got an invitation to dodgy folk to go and set up business in the UK to do dodgy stuff. I mean, it is strategically significant. Mr. Philip Meadowcroft, and then we go to Bob, then to Mark, then we'll move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Richard Emery finished all my lines, and I think it was a very important thing that he said there. And frankly, I'm amazed it's taken this long for you to realise the incredible strain that you put yourself under.
Well,
two things come to mind, which are shooting off in a strange direction, perhaps. The financing of TTF has got to be addressed again, I think.
Yeah.
You and I, rather many years ago, tried to do something, and Barclays, I think time has passed long enough for the group to know this. Andy and I went to Barclays Bank for a very senior level, at chairman level, and he allocated the meeting to the company secretary and the head of something else, I don't know what it was, and Andy gave his usual epistle, and the Barclays people hadn't got a clue what we were talking about. It was quite extraordinary. They felt that their systems were so perfect, they didn't need to become involved in any way, shape or form. And Andy, the only time in my life I've seen him lose his cool, and he just packed his bags up and we walked out.
Yeah.
And that was a very, very important moment. And I think that we've got to find perhaps a number of sources of finance, because it may be people like Joseph Rowntree, some of the think tanks that we've got to collaborate with Whether they could collaborate with us, I don't know, but it just strikes you that way. I'm concerned that there is a fashion for raising the bar, whether it be HMRC, the FCA, or whatever, as to what they're going to look into. And a lot of, for want of a better phrase, minor activities slip underneath the bar.
Yeah,
and that would be a shame in many ways. But you know, it goes against the grain of what you're talking about of not just picking off the low-hanging fruit, but some of the serious ones instead. But it's rather like the Environment Agency in my village saying that they are not prepared to contest a scheme which is going to cause flooding to 3 houses, but it would have done if it was for 600 houses.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there's a serious raising of the bar to reduce workloads, blah, 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 whatever. And that's all I've got to say. But for goodness sake, all of you think that what you have done these last 6 or 7 years is a little short of miraculous.
Well, thank you, Philip. I don't know what to say. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Mr. Bob Compton. I wasn't expecting this. I really wasn't expecting this, folks. I really wasn't.
Hi, Andy. Well, I'm going to echo everything everybody else has said so far. So, and I'm delighted you're actually now presenting your thoughts as to how you're going to actually organise what you get involved in, what you head up, what you lead on. I mean, I know David Stripp's not on the call, but David and I have, over the last 2 or 3 years, talked about you're doing far too much. How can we get you to sort of stand aside and let others get on with it, basically? But in that vein, on your matrix, can I suggest where you've got maybe in the middle box on the medium levels, call that a no?
It's on the maybe.
You then only have 3 boxes, the high, which is quite key, or where there's high in terms of impact with moderate number of organizations involved, or high in terms of knowing organizations around, but it's something that TTF picked up, which is a moderate type impact. That will reduce the workload considerably.
Bob, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've noticed Anne-Marie's comment about fundraising. Great comment, Anne-Marie. We're going to try and do some of that next year for sure. Thank you very much. Mr. Mark Bishop, and then I'll go back to my slides. Mark.
Thank you, Andy. I'd like to echo what everyone has said so far, and also pick up on a comment that was in the chat for those who can't read the chat, people on mobiles, and also what Bob has said just now about whether the maybes should be no's. So Jacqueline said, I'll just read out her comment. She said, to do or not to do, what might do mean? For each case, add a question. Take the lead, encourage others better placed to take the lead, and TTF contribute. I think that is absolutely good thinking. And it comes into what Bob said as well, because actually sometimes the right thing to do is not a yes or a no. It is to find somebody to partner with or to hand it over to. And in fact, there was a really good case about that, which we might talk about a little bit later on, which is the whole business about the SWIFT review and IRHPs. Now, in that particular case, there is the SME Alliance, there is the APPG on fair business banking. Those people clearly have at least as much domain expertise as we do. And, you know, without giving too much away, you know, Andy and I just recently had a call with Andy Keats where we were talking about exactly this, how we could coordinate efforts. So it may end up with us doing much less than, you know, all of it, maybe less than even a third of it. But other people who are very relevant will do things. If we can be, as somebody says, Barry James, lead versus catalyze, great question. If we can be the catalyst for stuff, that would be fantastic. Other people will do some of those things.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. This idea of things that we get involved with could be where we lead. Yeah, it may be where we've got, if you like, unique insight or unique motivations or unique capabilities or a unique agenda. That could be where we lead. There'll be other areas where we'll partner. There'll be other areas where we'll simply show support for what others are doing. I get this. I'm growing up. I'm getting it. Thank you. We're going to go quickly to Christoph. Christoph Grabowski. I always love saying Christoph's name. He knows this. Christoph, please introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello to everybody. Well, I am living in Poland, in Warsaw. Now I am retired, but with very long expertise on capital market in Poland, not only in Poland. But since it's a recreation after the Second World War, and also in international field, My main topic of interest is corporate governance. But now, especially after becoming retired, my main activity is as an expert witness with market manipulation. Well, as for the outline of the program of TTF, I think it's very important. That diagram 3x3 is very important to making a decision. But please have in mind that especially after Brexit, TTF becomes, I think, maybe a little bit too more directed to UK as such. So if you want to keep the international line, sometimes maybe you should choose topics that maybe are not of the highest priority, but to keep touch with those topics.
Understood. Understood. Christoph, Christoph, I absolutely get you. I'm going to cover some thoughts about the international piece a little bit later. So if you can allow me to come back to that shortly. Okay. Christoph, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go back to my slides. There's quite a bit to get through, folks. So I'm going to go at kind of breakneck speed, but I promise the slides will be circulated, which means that anything that you might miss now we'll be able to come to later. So where we got to is the explanation that regulatory failure is, if you like, our sweet spot. It's where we think we can make a real difference. And I'm going to start off by talking about how we see the regulatory failure landscape. Oh, I've gone too far. How we see the regulatory failure landscape. As mentioned earlier, our mission as a certified social enterprise is about promoting ongoing reform of the financial services sector so that it serves society better. We're all about making the kind of change that all of us want. We all want a financial industry to be transparent, truthful, and trustworthy. This slide simply speaks to the idea that all regulated markets are at risk of regulatory capture. That's not an opinion, that is a simple fact. Every regulated market is at risk of regulatory factor. And the evidence shows, we have people within the community who know a lot about this kind of stuff. The evidence shows that the financial services sector is particularly prone to it. And therefore, we believe that the blueprint for all of the world's financial regulatory frameworks must be cognizant of the risk of capture. There need to be sufficient counterweights to counterbalance that risk. The risk of capture, risk of conflicts, risk of, frankly, the regulatory framework not doing as it is designed to do. And to touch on Christoph's point, TTF is and will continue to be an international organization. And we are expecting that the focus we are placing on the UK's issues around regulatory failure will become issues we focus on in other countries too. The question is, to what extent am I personally involved in that? And of course, the subtext there is, can we do things overseas without me necessarily needing to be there when it happens? And that's a theme I'll be coming back to later on. So the point here is this: what I'm about to explain in terms of how we see fixing the regulatory failure problem in the UK is an example of the sort of things that need to be dealt with in other countries too. But for obvious reasons, I'm focusing on the UK's issues because it's where we are, it's where we are best known, and it's where we really understand the issues extremely well. Now, when talking about regulatory failure in the UK, you immediately start thinking about the FCA. The FCA is a profoundly important entity because it is the UK's primary conduct regulator. And I'm about to say something that I honestly never thought I would ever think. And it's a bit sad to say it. It's a bit sad to think it. When I started TTF in May 2015, if somebody has said to me, what do you think of the financial regulators in the FCA? I would have said, great, doing an important job really well, great big part of the solution. They've got their challenges, but essentially the FCA is a big part of the solution. I no longer think like that. I don't think that way anymore. I actually think, for reasons I hope I can explain in a moment, I actually think that the FCA is a great big part of the problem. I really do. And I hope I don't sound like I'm some kind of conspiracy theorist nut job. I really hope I don't come across like that. I formed the views I've formed because of the mountains of evidence that I've seen over the last 6+ years or so. I think it is entirely rational for me to come to the conclusion that the FCA is a big part of the problem. Many of our members are people who have suffered firsthand as a consequence of failures in the system, either partly or largely due to regulatory failure by the FCA. Many of our events have been directly about issues pertaining to regulatory failure by the FCA. And frankly, even the ones that are nothing to do with that subject, the issue of regulatory failure by the FCA comes up time after time after time. I would have to be dishonest as a person to not acknowledge the reality, which is that all of the evidence is suggesting that there is something seriously wrong with the FCA. That's kind of where I was about 4 months ago. But what has happened since then is that the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services started a call for evidence about the FCA, which means I've read 135-ish written submissions from people, and many of them are sad enough to make you want to cry. And after you feel like that, you find yourself feeling so disappointed and frankly so angry about what has happened. Now, I'm no fool. There's bound to be a degree of exaggeration. There's also bound to be a degree of misinformation. Sometimes people misunderstand stuff. I'm 58 years old. I know that stuff. I know that reality. But even taking that into account, the recurring themes that are coming through, submission after submission after submission, makes me think that the folks who talk about the FCA being not fit for purpose by design, I no longer think of them as being nut jobs. I can absolutely get where they're coming from. So my views about this matter have significantly hardened over the last 4 months or so, since that evidence has been coming to us. Now, beyond that kind of evidence, what else is there? There's the independent Gloucester report, which is about as scathing as it could have been. There's the supposedly independent, and no time to explain the supposedly independent Parker report, that even in its rather watered down, anaesthetized version is still pretty damn scathing of the FCA. The now 135 or so submissions that I've referred to, plus the many video testimonies. We've had testimonies from a wide range of people with very, very similar messages, going into granular detail about what the FCA did or didn't do that caused the regulatory failure, that caused the harm that they've experienced. And by the way, in some cases, it's actually even worse than that. It's not the FCA doing X or Y that causes regulatory failure that causes harm. In the case of some of the whistleblowers, they have been caused harm directly by the Financial Conduct Authority. Just this week, we've also had the SWIFT review published. And that is remarkably significant in the context of understanding just how bad the situation is. And I'm going to go on a slightly different tangent here now, and I'm going to show you this thread. I hope you can all see it. James Hurley is a very well-respected journalist, investigative reporter at the Times. He's done a lot this week in relation to the shenanigans around the SWIFT review. But James asked a question the other day on Twitter that is, when you think about it, off the scale significant. In fact, I can't quite get over just how significant the question is that James Hurley asked. And bear in mind, he didn't ask this question in a private conversation somewhere. He, as a professional journalist for the Times, who's been covering the SWIFT story with a great deal of, granular analysis, he asked a question that is shocking. Shocking. The question he asked was, and why did FSA, FCA, and the Treasury all lie about this interference? I'm going to repeat that question. Even now, I'm still quite kind of taken aback by the potency of that question. And why did FSA, FCA, and Treasury all lie about this interference? For those of you that don't know, the interference he's talking about is the interference of banks and the Treasury on the FCA in an attempt to reduce the redress payments to victims of bank abuse, some of whom have ended up literally taking their lives as a consequence of the profoundly horrific and shattering impact of their entire lives being torn up by banks behaving very, very, very badly to them. The question he didn't ask was, have the FCA, the FSA, FCA, and Treasury lied? That's not the question James Hurley's asking. He's asking the question, why did they do it? Here's a man who knows this topic really well, who's come to the conclusion, there's no doubt in his mind that the FCA, Treasury, and FSA before it lied. So here we have a significant part of our establishment being accused blatantly of lying. And that's how bad this problem is. And we are talking about something that is at the absolute core of the integrity of the financial ecosystem in our country. It cannot go on. If we continue to behave in such a way, then the eventual, the inevitable consequence is that sooner or later, there's going to be such a catastrophic collapse in trust in the system that we will have a massive, massive problem on our hands, if it's not that bad already. And frankly, I think it probably already is. In fact, this particular issue, this IRHP issue, we think this is a Watergate moment, ladies and gentlemen. Lies, collusion, cover up. This is the Watergate moment for the UK's financial services sector, in my opinion. And that's why we've already organised an event. We're calling it IRHP Gate, as you can see. February the 1st. It's going to be about as hard hitting as you can imagine. Even now, we are being told of stuff that further confirms that we are right in being very, very deeply concerned by the FCA. In addition to all the evidence I've touched on so far, we've got all of the events that we've run in the last year or so. These are all here on the slides. We'll circulate the slides, watch them if you haven't seen them before. There's loads of events there. There's loads of events here. There's loads of events here. And bear in mind, I go to every one of these. I hear it all, and without a doubt, it's impossible for any rational person to come to any conclusion different, I believe, to what I've concluded. So on balance, what does the evidence show? And I thought long and hard about how to phrase this response to that question. On balance, what does the evidence show? The evidence shows that I believe, most reasonable, independent, unconflicted, dispassionate, and objectively minded people who evaluate the mountain of evidence about the FCA that is now coming to the surface would come to a similar conclusion to us, which is that the FCA has got something seriously wrong with it. I'll flip back to the other slide in a minute. It's got something seriously wrong with it. It does have cultural and leadership issues that run very deep. It's captured, at least to a degree. It's conflicted, at least to a degree. It's confused about its purpose and priorities, at least to a degree. It has too many cozy relationships with the sector's trade bodies, such as UK finance, and the sector's big beasts, such as the banks. There is a woeful lack of transparency, truthfulness, and trustworthiness. There is a woeful lack of oversight and accountability. Those to whom it is accountable are too soft on it. I don't mean to be unkind to the Treasury Select Committee. There are some great individuals on it. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But collectively, it is too soft, you know, compared to, for example, how it once used to be under the leadership of Andrew Tari. It does fail to act in good faith, at least sometimes. It is dishonest, at least sometimes. It tries very hard to cover up its mistakes, at least sometimes. It has exploited and abused vulnerable whistleblowers. It has put them in harm's way to protect the FCA's own interests, at least sometimes. It acts immorally, at least sometimes. It is self-serving. It fails to make good use of the powers that it has. It fails to enforce effectively. It has a huge revolving door problem that it allows to perpetuate. Its financial services consumer panel is no longer effective. I do believe that it once was. Its consumer networks are not effective enough. It fails to harness the power of deterrent. It has misinformed Parliament. It is open to the Treasury's competitiveness agenda when doing so will lead to even more consumer harm. The sad thing, and I really want to stress this, is that the vast majority of employees of the FCA, past and present, are good people, very good people, working hard to do an honest job as best as they can. But the organization itself stops them from being effective regulators. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Having seen the evidence I've seen, I'm absolutely convinced of that. There's no reason for confidence about the transformation project that is underway. In a moment, we're going to ask Mark Bishop to speak to that particular point. But just before we do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to ask Barry James just to very quickly, Barry, we're short of time. Please very quickly share with us the point that you wanted to make when you put your hand up, and then we'll jump swiftly to Mark Bishop. As quickly as you can, please, Barry.
Thanks, Andy. Just briefly first to affirm everything that has been said before about this focus and this move. You know, I'm fully behind you in because we've spoken about it. But I want to also point out that I've devoted almost 10 years of my life to deal with a lot of the issues, and as part of that, a keen observer of the FCA and the FSA before that, who's devoted, as I say, a lot of time and effort understanding how it works. And part of that was a conversation with Sir Hector Sant, who led the organisation for quite some time, and around 2008. And I put the quote in the chat there, when I asked him about the situation, he exploded at the way that the FSA and the FCA is treated by government. Now, I'm no apologist for the FCA or FCA, by the way, but he exploded, saying that it is the whipping boy for the government. So I just want to help to put this in further context. It was me who commented, I was that apparent nut job who's being proved right by time. If you're too far ahead of your time, that can be your fate. So I'm putting my hand up to being actually ahead of the curve here. But whether the original, I'll qualify, whether the original design was deliberately bad is of no great consequence, but there's been a decade that I'm aware of, and I think more before that, when there's gross issues and problems in the culture, but also in the relationship with government. The FCA is independent theoretically, but it's only independent when the government wants it to be, and when the government doesn't want it to be. The other major issue it's the bin for everyone. It's the bin into which all the difficult problems are put. Well, we'll deal with that in regulation. Well, you know, all sorts of things get pushed into the FCA, and often the things that regulators shouldn't be doing, but law enforcement or the law should be doing.
Yeah.
So final part of that point, Andy, is I've got in front of me a triangle. You know what that triangle is. It's Parliament, government, and the FCA, and you can't tackle this problem without realizing that's the immediate context, but the wider context is the circle around that, which is the absolute cynicism. And I use the word advisedly because after we talked about this the other day, Andy, I went and looked it up, and the word cynicism applies really clearly, not to my attitude to this. I just say as a side comment, I've spent many years of my life working for the public good, and cynics don't do that. But the cynicism of the financialization of this, the motivations are clear to read. They're clear to read in everything Andy's just said. So utterly, Andy, you're completely right on this, and I add 10 years of observation and work as weight behind what you're saying here.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much indeed. I get it. I really do get it. I could absolutely understand why somebody may have the view that the FCA is not fit for purpose by design. I absolutely get that. Thanks, Barry. Let's jump to Mark Bishop. Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Could you possibly call up the slide?
Yes, indeed. I'll do that now. Share screen. And slideshow, here we go. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I think that the strategy of trying to get regulators to perform their jobs to a satisfactory standard is a really good one for us at TTF, because if we achieve that, then actually most of our job is done, because then the regulator will do its job, and our job is mostly to make sure that the regulators continue to perform well and to bring to their attention the rare examples of financial misconduct that they haven't already spotted and dealt with as they should be doing. So then the question would follow from there, why don't we just sit back for the next year or so and wait for the FCA's own widely kind of trailed transformation project to run its course? Well, the reason is we don't have a great deal of faith in it. And as Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used to create them. I'd even go a stage further and say we can't allow the same economic incentives and cultural groupthink to influence the change programme. So if we look at what's happened about the change programme, probably the first big announcement was that Megan Butler was appointed to the role of Executive Director for Transformation. When that happened, I realised that was a bad move, because I knew she'd been involved in the Connaught screw-ups, because I lead the Connaught Action Group. I also had a very strong suspicion she'd been involved in London Capital and Finance, and sure enough, that was confirmed by Dame Gloucester's independent review, which, unlike the Connaught one, actually named the executives responsible. And so I then thought, I bet that this is a shoo-in. So I submitted a Freedom of Information request, and sure enough, what it showed was that the job was not advertised externally. No search consultants were engaged to find candidates, and there were only 2 internal candidates. Of course, the other one being the other person who'd been heading up an authorization department that was to be merged together, and therefore would be losing his job. So, so it was really a show-in from the outset that she got the job, and sure enough, the Treasury Committee criticised that appointment. Now, interestingly, she recently announced that she would be leaving the FCA, and at that time, the FCA also announced that there would be a replacement. This replacement is Emily Shepherd. Now, interestingly, when Megan Butler was appointed, the reason why the job was not advertised externally was that the FCA said it was so big a job and so important that it was filled immediately, they couldn't wait for somebody to have to give notice in their previous role. They needed somebody to start immediately. It's that big a job. And even at the Treasury Committee last week, Charles Randall, chair of the FCA, said we're a year into a project that's going to take at least another 3 years. So why is it that Emily Shepherd, who is the Executive Director for Authorisations, is being asked to double up and do the transformation job on the side while still running the Authorisations Department, particularly given that the Authorisations Department lets through pretty much any rubbish onto the register that wants to get onto the register, and there are huge delays in it considering the legitimate applications as well. You know, a cynic might say that actually Nikhil Rathi is desperate for the transformation job not to go to an external candidate, because if an external candidate came in, they might actually want to transform the organisation, and that we can't be having that. Then you look at Nikhil Rathi himself. He seems a nice man, doesn't he? He sounds quite convincing when he speaks. But he started his career in the Treasury, and he was then seconded to work in the private office of first Blair and then Brown when they were the Prime Minister. And of course, this was in an era when there was literally an open door policy for bank bosses at number 10. So this guy from the Treasury was on the inside facilitating these things. He then got his thank you job. He then, I must say, was sent back to the Treasury to help kind of unpick the mess of the global financial crisis, which this kind of regulatory capture had caused. And when that happened, you know, we know that all sorts of things occurred that don't pass the sniff test. And you might even ask whether some of the people that were involved in fixing the financial system actually condoned acts that we might now see as being, breaches of regulatory rules, or perhaps even illegal acts that were needed to recapitalise the banks. But sure enough, he got his thank you job as the chief executive of the London Stock Exchange. So he was there very much as a kind of cheerleader for the industry and for the financial sector in the city. Therefore, he was kind of very much biased towards the competitiveness agenda, the race to the bottom. Angie and I have been very heavily involved in dealing with a number of employees of the FCA, not least the one known as Leslie. Obviously, Leslie is not the person's real name, whose testimony is already on the APPG website. And these FCA employees consistently talk about the organisation having a defective culture. Basically, the senior leadership has a particular agenda that it wants to follow, and anybody below that challenges that, for example says, we believe regulatory action is needed in this area, the senior leadership doesn't agree, it's not going to happen. And if people push it too hard, they get managed out of the organisation. And thereafter, as one of these people told us, actually, you can't even mention them by name thereafter. You can only talk about them by their initials. So clearly what we've got here is a very defective culture. And the cynicism spectrum, I think, is an interesting one. Is it the case that the FCA is just by chance not fit for purpose, or is it not fit for purpose by design? And obviously one of the things that's shown in the Swift report, which is really interesting, is for the first time evidence of the Treasury lobbying the FCA not to take a course of action that would be harmful to an industry incumbent, namely a set of banks. We've never seen that before. We've seen it now. And obviously, at some point, the police are going to have to get involved in looking into whether misconduct in public office occurred, because officers of statutory bodies have an obligation to perform their statutory functions to reasonable standard. If that hasn't happened, there may be a need for prosecutions. So for these reasons, it is, in our view, absolutely the job of Transparency Task Force to try and drive politicians to believe that it's their job to hold to account the FCA to have genuine transformation and not just something that looks like transformation but isn't.
Mark, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Believe me, if we felt confident that the FCA could fix itself, 2022 would be a breeze, but there's no reason for that confidence at all for the reasons we set out. So, given what we believe, we should continue to be what we call a critical friend to the FCA. We always go about our work in a pretty civilized and polite way. We think it's appropriate for us to think of ourselves as a critical friend to the FCA. Ultimately, if the FCA does the sorts of things we think it should do, then it will be to the FCA's benefit. This is all virtuous stuff. We should also continue to gather evidence about the FCA's failings. We should shine a big bright light on that evidence, as per the sunlight is the best disinfectant saying, and we should identify and do our best to deal with the long list of issues that will become our battlegrounds for regulatory reform. So what you're going to see now, folks, is a great big long list of the battlegrounds for 2022. And a big message here is help us. Please, please, please help us. Please, we need as much help as we can. There is a great big battleground around the duty of care with private rights to action issue. There's a great big battleground around the competitiveness agenda, which is essentially where it appears the government is trying to propose a deregulatory strategy. If it happens, history will repeat itself. There will be deregulation. Ultimately, it's going to cause chaos and harm, and people, society is going to suffer. There is a great big battleground around the complaints and compensation scheme, the lack of true engagement with consumer bodies by the FCA, the revolving door problem, the general lack of transparency and accountability at the FCA. All these are battlegrounds that need to be fought. We've got here we've got an example of how we are, for the first time, I know this will make Sarah smile, for the first time properly trying to kind of plan and organize our work rather than just flying by the seat of the pants, which is how we've tended to do things in the past. So here we've got an approach to organizing our work. So it's just an example. For every one of the battlegrounds we've just seen, for every one of them, we need to produce a little slide like this. First column is, what is it we want to do? What is the goal? So this example is about duty of care with a private right to action. The goal is to make the case for a private right of action to accompany the consumer duty. That's the what we're trying to achieve. The why, if you like, the benefits of doing it. This would increase the chance that consumers would be compensated if they were ripped off. It would also, keep on, it would also dramatically improve market conduct, because companies would know they were in real jeopardy if they acted badly. This would in turn reduce the introduction of poor products entering the market. Can I just say something on a bit of a tangent? Please watch last week's Treasury Select Committee hearing, where the Treasury Select Committee interviewed the chairman and the chief exec of the FCA, and listen out for the bit where, in effect, the people at the FCA are saying that it wouldn't be a good idea to introduce a private right to action because it would it's so stupid to even say it. It would discourage companies from putting products into the market that might cause harm. That is, in effect, what they were saying. Crazy. The how is the battle plan. No need to go into detail, but in the how column, we sort out what it is we're actually planning to try to do. So we need to create a document like that, a slide with a what, a why, and a how for each of the battle plans that I've just been referring to. And if we now go to our chart again, what we've got is hopefully you'll all understand why regulatory failure is what we've put in the top right hand corner. We've got our no's, we've got our maybes, and we've also got, just moving on, the other battlegrounds. We don't want to just deal with the FCA related issues, just the regulatory reform issues. There are many, many, many other battlegrounds that need sorting, that ought to be sorted, that TTF collectively can deal with. Yeah, I'm sure a few of you will be pleased to see that Companies House is one of the ones that's listed there. But we ourselves can't do it all. So what we need is for volunteers to step forward to help with the leadership of how we tackle these other battlegrounds. Now, what I've done, just to give you a feel for it, I've put onto the chart where some of these other issues sit in terms of the levels of harm, the scarcity of organizations, and TTF's capability. The bigger the blob, the bigger our capability to make a meaningful difference. So when I get time, I'll put all the issues on that chart somewhere. There's no real science to this. It's just a guide to our decision making. That's why I put those on there. And moving on once again, oops, I'll keep jumping through slides, forgive me. What does this mean for all of our groups? So we've got 25 groups. What we're doing now is we're effectively putting them into two buckets. One bucket we're calling our primary group. These are the groups that are directly relevant to the regulatory reform challenge, the top right-hand corner. These are the groups where I personally and those immediately around me within TTF are going to be driving forward. Okay, that's where we're going to be, hyper focused. However, we've also got lots of other groups. Our secondary groups are those that are not directly relevant to our fixing the FCA initiative. However, and this is important that I stress, they do remain very important to TTF's wider objectives. We desperately need people to work with us on them. We are actively looking for these groups to be member-led. So we'll still be involved, we'll still be there, but we can hope that others will actually be driving the issue forward, because we won't be able to, because we're going to be focused on this other stuff for the reasons that I've hopefully explained clearly enough. Here's a continuation of the list. So a key point, please, if you have any interest in these issues and you want to play a part in them, then please step forward and we would welcome you with open arms as a leader for those groups. We want to create a system where there's a good balance between governance in terms of making sure that the groups don't go off doing weird stuff, and effectiveness. We'll find that balance, we'll create a framework, and we'll let people free to go forward and actually make a difference in that way. I hope that's clear. Other priorities for 2022. Funding, which was mentioned earlier, funding is a massive problem. We really are fighting with one hand tied behind our back. Sometimes it feels like two. We are seriously skint, we're seriously constrained. The mind boggles about what we could actually do if we had proper resource like so many other organizations, of which I'm remarkably envious. One of the things I'm going to be doing is trying to become more strategic and to become more effective in terms of fundraising for TTF. So what I'm doing is my Fridays, I'm going to be calling them my Fridays for future and funding. So that's all about planning and strategizing and fundraising, on the phone, speaking to organizations, trying to persuade them to back and support TTF. There's various other things we want to do in terms of our fundraising activity. Operational objective for 2022, we want to start using a proper contact management system. We've got 4,000, I think it's about 4,800 people who get the Transparency Times each week. We just put this into context. Rough numbers, by the end of the year, we'll have 5,000 people getting the Transparency Times each week. Yeah, the beginning of this year, it was 2,700. Can you understand the amount of work that's gone on by the team, the small team I've got to actually make that happen? It's been incredible. So we need to put a proper contact management system in place to actually properly manage the relationships we have with our members. And there's a great big job to be done still around governance and the idea of TTF morphing either in whole or in part to becoming a charity. Mark came up with this great idea, which I really like. He said, "Why don't you tell them about your Christmas wish list?" So here it is, folks. My Christmas wish list. Volunteers, please, please, please. Anybody that wants to get involved and start to play a more active and proactive role within the TTF, please do. You know, it would be music to my ears if somebody came forward and said, "Andy, I'd like a bit of responsibility for doing this and this. What needs to happen?" That would be brilliant from my point of view. In particular, we're looking for support in terms of PR and public affairs. We've got a massive job to do around PR and public affairs, so that would be really, really cool. We want more subscription members, of course. We want people to volunteer to help with our consultations. Anybody that's willing to help us in any way is the basic message there. I think that pretty much takes me to the end of the slides. It does. So, time for questions, comments, and suggestion, please. Thank you all so much for being here, for being part of this this journey. It's getting more and more interesting day by day. I can honestly tell you, just I can't tell you too much, but the stuff that's coming out of the woodwork now about the FCA and Treasury, etc., is just it really is pretty spectacular. So, slides done. I'll circulate them all. Between now and January the 4th, please let me have your feedback. I've seen some great suggestions in the chat, for example, changing the phrasing instead of using phrases like "at least sometimes." I'll absorb all that input. Email me, write to me, phone me, do whatever you like. Let me have your thoughts, please, so that I can improve on what we've done so far. And thank you again for being here, and thank you again for listening to me go on and on and on about what we're trying to do. So, I'm now going to, oh, I can see people clapping. This is lovely. I really didn't expect this kind of reaction. I really didn't. I'm going to stop rabbiting now, and I'm going to breathe. And I'm going to invite everyone, if there wants to raise a hand. Could I please invite you to be as succinct as you can be, just so we can get around everybody that might want to say something. So please just raise your hand, or digitally or otherwise, if you'd like to say something. Thank you. Mr. Neil Taylor, thanks for getting stuck in, sir. Over to you. Neil, take a moment to introduce yourself and then share your comment, question, suggestion.
Yeah, hi there. I'm relatively new to the transparency task force. I sort of put myself forward being, I'm a retired finance director, so I've got expertise in the financial aspects of running a business. And I also did a lot of development abroad. I did a lot of development in Spain, Italy, Portugal, set companies up there and expanded the business, and we sold the business in 2012. So I've got a pretty good exposure to how businesses run and how they operate at board level, and it's interesting to see what you're doing here in the group. It does seem it needs organisation and restructuring and thinking and focusing itself, and it's vital that you do that. Otherwise, we'll try and do too much and achieve nothing. You know.
Yes. It's
a risk, and I think the FCA one. I'm just worried about the exposure to people saying things and getting themselves into trouble for saying things. So we must be careful how it disseminates down. I'm conscious of that, really. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, and making sure we don't compromise ourselves, because these people do like to put pressure on.
They do.
On people, as we've seen with the whistleblowers. I just couldn't believe the whistleblowers being blamed for things, or intimidated, if you like, by this organisation. I think rather than blame, I think it's intimidated by them. And I think we've got to really sort of work out how we approach that and deal with that. And I think it is the most important thing to do in the next 12, 18 months. I think it's get the regulatory authorities working in a regulated way and doing their job. And I think that's important, very important.
It certainly is. Thank you so much indeed, Neil. You've made two very good points. First of all, you would be a great addition to what we call our project management group. So we have a project management group that meets once a month for an hour, and it basically helps me to get organized. And frankly, the project management group has been a big part of the impetus behind the sorts of rationalizations we've been talking about today. So Neil, would you allow me to get you to spend an hour a month with me on that basis as a volunteer?
Yeah, no problem at all. I can do that. No problem.
That's brilliant. We'll get you in for that. I'll get you organised on that. Super stuff. And in particular on the financial side, you'll get on really well with Sarah. She's got an accounting background as well as you.
Cool.
And as you can tell, we really need some help on the financial side of it. So I'll get that done.
Yeah, no problem.
You're very wise to point out the exposure we could have if we say the wrong things. You know, literally yesterday, just to evidence the fact that we do think about that stuff, we were going to call the event on February the 1st, which we're now calling IRHP Gate. We were going to call it something different. We decided to change it because it might have been too much of a red flag.
Yes.
Everything we do is always based on evidence. Everything we do, we can always say, there's the pile of evidence that gives me confidence that what I'm saying is evidenceable in court. It's very wise of you to be cognizant of that as well. Thanks, Neil. Thank you very much. I see Mark's raised his hand. Mark Bishop, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to respond to what Neil said, which I think was a very good and constructive point. And I think there are two parts to it. The first one is really what you've said, Andy, which is evidence. So, for example, in the next year, we might be more likely to hold a symposium only after we've asked the people who are involved in that particular case to give us really compelling evidence. And we will scrutinise the evidence. So we would not kind of give a platform to people unless we were really comfortable that they had the evidence. That evidence thing is very much what we've learnt when we've been doing this APBT call for evidence about the FCA, because within that, inevitably, you get some people who turn up and make swingeing allegations, but there isn't evidence there. And sometimes that's okay, because if 10 people make the same allegation and they're not connected to each other, the probability is that it's true, but it's stuff you can't evidence. But wherever we can, we've been asking people for evidence. So if you look, for example, at some of the call for evidence responses, the written ones that are up on the website, you'll see that they, for example, have links. Mine has links to a load of things I put on a Google Drive. If you look at George Patelis' one, there are documents at the end of his where he deals with various things that he's alleged during his video. So we're asking people for evidence, so we're getting good at that. I think the other thing is that we are getting good at protecting people. So, a number of the people have come forward from the FCA, for example, to want to give us testimony for the call for evidence. They are very concerned about their own position, either because they still work in the FCA or because they no longer work there, but they work in regulated, activities in authorised firms. They don't want
House
to be
rules applies, eh?
Exactly. So to give you an example, if you look at the video that we call Leslie, that video was actually recorded by, a very good and responsible member of the Transparency Task Force team, and Jan Floyd Douglas. She doesn't work for the FCA, but she's using the words of a person who does. We also asked that person to change their answers to 2 or 3 of the questions, because even if you didn't give the person's name in the written testimony, a person at the FCA could probably work out who they were from the answers to those questions. So we changed them. They're still true. The answers are accurate. They're not lies, but they are sufficiently vague that they don't tell you who that person is. So we can do things like this to protect individuals. There's also a volunteer, I'm not going to name that person, who in the last week said because they work in the industry, they are a little bit nervous that they might be kind of targeted by the FCA. So we took a prudent step, which I won't describe, that will help make that person feel a little bit more protected. So, there are things that we will do to make sure that the FCA cannot look at us and say, or cannot point to us when talking to politicians and say, these people at Transparency Task Force, they keep saying that we are captured, we are incompetent, we're dishonest. But actually, look at all these unevidenced allegations. They are a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Ignore them. What we want the politicians to say is, actually, but hang on a minute, look at this paper here. There are links to emails. Those emails are damning, aren't they? Look at this person here. This person is actually one of your former employees. And look at what they're saying. You're honestly telling me that those allegations are untrue? So bit by bit, what we're trying to do effectively is to hem the FCA in. So every excuse it pops up, every pretend transformation scheme, etc., the politicians will say, yeah, but sorry, mate, that's bullshit. Sorry, Nicola, you've actually got to fix it, or you've got to step aside and be replaced by people who will.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anne-Marie Borg, lovely to see you as always, Anne-Marie. Comment allez-vous?
Oh, thank you. Your French is improving.
Yeah, bit by bit.
No, just to thank you and to add to what, thank you all, I mean, and to Mark as well, and to add to what Mark was saying, what I'm seeing at the moment, first of all, to have such strong focus is essential. And I think it's going to clarify the whole of the coming year. And I think sometimes we forget that the impact we have on the immediate has a long lasting impact. It's
Yes.
sort of, it's like creating a wave. And I think it's really important for the TTF to be very visible as an organization with a philosophy, with a strong impact long term. It's not just, you know, in the near future. It's not for the next few years. We're again talking about what I talk about all the time in education, cathedral thinking. We are putting the foundation of a society which is changing. And I think that's immense. That's huge. Never forget that, Andy, please.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Thank you very, very much. Wise words as always. Your support's been wonderful from day one. It really, really has been. Would anybody else like to say something? It looks like we're all good. Sarah, you don't need to say anything, but I just want to say I want to thank you for once again over the years badgering me to behave a bit more like the way I'm planning to behave in the future. Thanks, Sarah. I get there in the end, don't I? I get there in the end. Okay, I think if everyone's happy, we can bring things to a close. I think we will. You've all given me an hour and a half or so to give me a chance to share with you what we're thinking of doing. Thank you very, very much for giving me that chance. Thank you very, very much for all the support you've given over however long it is you've been involved with the TTF. I have to say a huge thanks to my team who are busy working away. They can't be here. And in particular, Tina and Chelsea, who've been with me for quite some time now. They're doing a marvelous job, an absolutely remarkable job of coping with all the work that I create. And in particular, I'd like everybody, if you don't mind, to take a moment to thank Mark Bishop, who has kept me sane during this year, when otherwise, if it had not been for Mark, I'm not sure I would have been. His support has been just off the scale, Mark. It really has been. It really has been.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. I have to say, just from my part, firstly, this is the first full year I've done working with Transparency Task Force. It's been a huge honour. It's been inspirational. What has really kind of meant a lot to me is when I spent, 8 years or so running the Connaught Action Group, I thought that I was a lone voice in the wilderness. I thought I'm the only person here who sees that we effectively have no financial regulation in the UK. But when I became involved in Transparency Task Force, I met you, I met whistleblowers, I met people who are victims of other kind of misconduct and regulatory failure cases, and I actually realised, no, there's a load of people, we've all experienced the same thing. I'm not mad, it is true. And even better now, I think we've got an absolute focus on how we're going to fix it. We're going to fix financial regulation, first in the UK, then we're going to export it to the world.
Mark, thank you very, very much indeed. Almost as if I planned things properly, but I hadn't. We are closing at exactly the same time. I'm looking at a room full of smiley faces. Wish you all a wonderful, wonderful Christmas and a happy, happy New Year. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Andy.
You'll never understand how nice it is to receive the feedback I've received today. Thank you very, very much indeed. Bye-bye, folks. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.